Louis could hear his mother's voice carrying from downstairs before she even finished calling his name. It had that tone that meant she was already halfway out the door and wasn't in the mood for debate. "Louis, it's time to go." He pulled himself away from his computer, his eyes adjusting reluctantly from the glow of the screen to the hallway beyond his bedroom door. "Have a nice night," he called back, intending to settle right back into his chair. But his plans were short-lived. Before he could even adjust his headset again, the door creaked open and his mom stepped inside. "Come on, you know how this works. The Garners and I have our grown-up night every other week. Next door. Now." Louis tried the usual defense. "Why can't I just stay here by myself? I'm perfectly capable of microwaving leftovers." But she was already shaking her head, citing the same reasoning as always. "We've been over this. You can't be left alone in the late evening. Now turn off your game, please. We're already running late." Louis sighed in that long, drawn-out theatrical way that only made his mother raise an eyebrow, and he logged out of the match. A lost cause anyway, given the inexperienced team he'd been stuck with. By the time his mom was shepherding him across the lawn to the Garners' place, their car was already idling out front. She passed a small duffel to Mr. Garner, who tossed it into the trunk alongside a couple of other bags. Mrs. Garner greeted his mom with that air kiss on the cheek thing that always made Louis wonder if adults actually liked doing that or just felt obligated. Mr. Garner slid into the driver's seat while Mrs. Garner called into the house. "Priscilla, Louis is here." The name always made Louis think of a historical novel or an old painting, though Priscilla, who insisted on Prissy, never acted like she was from another era. She came jogging from the backyard, waving to her parents and Louis's mom. "You kids be good," his mom called as the car pulled away. Prissy didn't waste any time. "Come on, Missy's in the backyard," she said, looping her fingers through his and leading him toward the back door. Melissa, forever Missy, was hauling a plastic wading pool across the lawn like it weighed nothing. The late-day sun still hung warm over the fence, catching the bright colors of the girls' outfits. Missy wore a yellow tank top with black shorts, while Prissy had paired white shorts with a dark blue top that had impossibly thin straps. Louis raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it a little late for a swim?" Missy grinned. "Not swimming, we're setting up for a game." She nudged the pool into place a good 10 feet away from another one already stationed nearby. "A fun one," Prissy added with a mischievous smile. Louis, skeptical, folded his arms. "What are we, 5?" But Prissy was already explaining the rules with the same excitement she had whenever she'd cooked up something new. "You stand in your pool and try to keep the ball away from the person in the middle. If the middle player gets the ball within 3 minutes, they win. If not, they lose and have to do a forfeit." Missy chimed in. "Everyone gets 2 turns in the middle. Loser does the winner's chosen challenge. Could be anything harmless. Sing a silly song, balance something on your head, hop across the yard like a bunny." She gave Louis a pointed look as if to say, "We're not talking about boring forfeits here." Louis gave a reluctant shrug, but he was secretly intrigued. They decided the first middle player with a quick game of rock, paper, scissors. Missy beat Prissy, which meant Prissy faced off against Louis. Louis thought quickly. Prissy had just lost to rock, so she'd probably switch. He guessed right, throwing paper against her rock. "Paper wraps rock," he said, stepping into the far pool opposite Missy. The timer sat on the porch steps, set to 3 minutes, and Prissy took her place between them, ready to lunge whichever way the ball went. From the first toss, Louis could tell the game was trickier than it looked. Prissy was quick on her feet, darting to cut off passes and forcing them to fake and feint like seasoned players. Missy lobbed the ball to Louis, calling, "In the middle!" just to rub it in as Prissy spun around. Louis managed to keep his footing in the shallow plastic pool, sending the ball back in a high arc. Time seemed to stretch as the 3 of them moved and laughed, the splashes and thumps of the ball filling the yard. When the timer finally rang, Louis still had the ball in his hands. "Ha, forfeit for you," he told Prissy, trying to sound smug. She puffed out a breath but smiled gamely. "Fine, you can use it any time tonight." Louis thought for a second, then said, "You have to—" He hesitated, then landed on something silly but safe. "Wear oven mitts for the next round." Missy laughed so hard she almost dropped the ball. "Perfect!" A few moments later, Prissy was flapping her oven-mittened hands and struggling to catch anything tossed her way, while Louis tried not to crack up at how much harder it made her task. The minutes flew by, and soon they were swapping positions, each trying different goofy challenges as forfeits, balancing a cushion on your head while playing, spinning in place before each pass, or doing all your throws underhanded. As the game wore on, the forfeits became more and more inventive. Louis found himself hopping in one foot for an entire round, which was far more exhausting than he'd expected. Prissy had to wear a floppy sun hat that kept slipping over her eyes. Missy ended up reciting tongue twisters every time she caught the ball. The competitiveness was there, but it was wrapped in laughter and teasing, with no real stakes beyond bragging rights and the temporary embarrassment of doing something ridiculous. By the time the last round ended, they were breathless and leaning on the sides of the pools for support, the yard littered with the odd assortment of props they'd accumulated for forfeits. Prissy checked the time and grinned. "We've got ages before dinner. You know what that means." Louis eyed her warily. "It better not be something involving those pools again." "Nope," Missy said, eyes sparkling. "We're taking this game inside. Forfeit challenges are way more fun when we have the whole house." She exchanged a look with her sister that Louis recognized, the one that meant they'd been scheming. But after the laughter and silliness of the last hour, he wasn't sure he minded. He followed them toward the back steps, curious and maybe just a little concerned about what they had planned next. Once inside, Prissy headed straight for her room, while Missy ducked into the hall closet and returned with an armful of scarves, hats, and a couple of colorful wigs from some forgotten costume box. "Since you still have a forfeit to pay me," she told Louis, "I think it's time for the makeover challenge." Louis groaned. Seriously? But they were already clearing space on the floor, laying out their supplies like professional stylists. It wasn't about changing who he was. It was about leaning into the ridiculousness of it. They wrapped a feather boa around his shoulders, perched a sequin top hat on his head, and insisted he strike a fashion pose while they snapped pictures on Prissy's phone. "You're going in the Hall of Fame," she declared, showing him the gallery of silly snapshots they'd taken of each other over the years. The afternoon light faded into early evening as they cycled through costume combinations. Louis in oversized sunglasses, Missy wearing 3 hats stacked on top of each other, Prissy balancing on one leg while holding a stuffed flamingo like it was an award. The forfeits blurred into pure play, no longer about winners and losers, but about seeing who could get the most laughs. When Mrs. Garner texted to check in, Prissy sent her a photo of all 3 of them crammed together under one giant blanket cape. "Everything's fine," she wrote, and Louis couldn't help but agree. It wasn't the evening he'd planned, but it was turning out to be one he wouldn't forget anytime soon. They hadn't been back inside for long before the smell of dinner began drifting from the kitchen, but it was still a good while before anyone would think to set the table. Prissy leaned back against her bed with an exaggerated sigh, clearly in plotting mode. Missy sat cross-legged on the rug, rifling through a shoebox full of odds and ends, bits of ribbon, costume jewelry, a few markers that might or might not still work. "All right," Missy announced. "Since the makeover challenge went so well for me, I think it's only fair that Louis gets his turn as stylist." Louis blinked. "You mean I get to make you look silly?" "Exactly," Prissy confirmed, "but only if you accept the forfeit you owe from the last round outside. It's your ticket to creative control." Louis pretended to think it over, though secretly the idea of turning the tables on them was tempting. "Fine," he said, drawing it out like he was being generous, "but you're both in for it." For the next half hour, the bedroom turned into a whirlwind of mismatched accessories and uncontrollable laughter. Louis stacked scarves around Prissy's neck until she looked like a walking laundry pile. Missy had to wear 2 of her own t-shirts at the same time, one backward and one inside out, plus an old Halloween mask that was far too small and kept sliding halfway up her face. They played up the drama of it, posing as if they were on a fashion runway, while Louis narrated in an overly serious tone, making up elaborate design inspirations for each ridiculous combination. Prissy's Scarf Mountain became the Alpine Adventure, and Missy's Layered Chaos was Postmodern Laundry Day. Even though he was the one directing the chaos, Louis found himself laughing so hard he could barely take pictures. Eventually, Missy flopped onto the bed, tossing the too small mask aside. "Okay, stylist, you've got skills, but we need to switch gears, or we'll be too worn out to even eat." She gestured toward the living room. "Movie time?" Prissy perked up immediately. "Ooh, yes, let's pick something epic." After some negotiation and a brief arm wrestling match over the remote, they settled on an animated adventure they all knew well enough to quote half the lines. Louis sank into the couch between them, still wearing the top hat from earlier because, according to Prissy, it's now your signature look. As the movie played, they tossed popcorn into each other's mouths, with varying degrees of accuracy, inventing popcorn forfeits for every miss. 1 miss meant you had to swap seats. 2 misses meant you had to sing along to the next song, no matter how off-key. By the 3rd round, Louis was belting out an emotional ballad while Missy pretended to play backup violin with a broom handle. Prissy conducted them with the TV remote like she was leading an orchestra. It was utterly ridiculous, but there was something about the shared silliness that made it feel like the evening was racing by far faster than any of them wanted. Halfway through the 2nd act, the doorbell rang, sharp and insistent. Missy jumped up, calling, "That's dinner," but didn't slow her stride toward the kitchen. "Someone else get it," she called over her shoulder. From the couch, Prissy shook her head. "Can't. I'm in the middle of a critical scene here." Louis frowned. "Why me?" "Because," Prissy said, eyes never leaving the screen, "you've still got 1 mini forfeit left and I'm cashing it in now. You have to answer the door wearing that top hat and—" She glanced around, then grabbed a feather boa from the floor and tossed it at him. "This." Louis groaned but didn't argue. After all, the rules of the game had become their own strange kind of honor code. He looped the boa around his neck, tilted the hat at a rakish angle, and opened the door to find a delivery driver balancing a bag of food and a drink carrier. She smiled in that friendly, mildly amused way people sometimes do when they're not sure if they've stumbled into a costume party or a dare. "Evening," she said, handing over the order. Louis did his best to play it cool. "Thanks." "Nice hat," she added with a wink before heading back to her car. Louis shut the door quickly, feeling his ears warm, but also, to his surprise, a bit proud for going through with it. They spread the food out picnic style on the living room floor, choosing to keep the movie running while they ate. Every so often, one of them would pause mid-bite to act out a favorite line or mimic a character's expression. By the time the credits rolled, the wrappers and empty cups were piled high, and all 3 of them were leaning back against the couch with satisfied sighs. "All right," Missy said after a moment. "I've got one last challenge in me tonight, and I'm going big." She looked straight at Louis. "This is your final forfeit, and it's non-negotiable. You have to create a ridiculous bedtime outfit for yourself and actually wear it." Louis raised an eyebrow. "Define ridiculous." Prissy was already digging through the costume box. Something with at least 3 unrelated themes, like pajama pants with a superhero cape and maybe a pair of bunny ears. In less than 5 minutes, they had assembled his ensemble. Plaid pajama bottoms, a sparkly green cape, the top hat still perched on his head, and fuzzy socks patterned with watermelons. It was absurd enough to make him laugh out loud when he caught sight of himself in the hallway mirror. "Perfect," Missy declared. "Now, tradition says we take an official group photo to mark the end of game night. They set up the phone on the coffee table, balanced against a stack of books, and huddled together in front of it, making goofy faces and peace signs. The flash went off 3 times in quick succession, and then they were all leaning over to swipe through the results. "Best one yet," Prissy announced, tapping the middle photo where Louie's cape was caught mid-flutter. "We'll put it in the Game Night Legends album." Louis rolled his eyes but didn't argue. The truth was, the whole evening, pools, forfeits, makeover antics, and all, had been unexpectedly fun. He'd walked over begrudgingly, certain it would be another dull babysitting evening. Instead, he'd found himself laughing harder than he had in weeks. Later, as they gathered up the leftover costumes and tossed the empty food bags, Prissy glanced at the clock. Bedtime in 20 minutes. Missy grinned. And that means exactly enough time for one last lightning round challenge. No props, just pure speed and creativity. Whoever can come up with the funniest made-up word and use it in a sentence wins bragging rights until next game night. The 3 of them stood in the middle of the living room, dramatically thinking like contestants on a quiz show, before blurting out nonsense words and ridiculous sentences until they were doubled over with laughter again. It was the kind of ending that didn't feel like an ending at all, just a pause until the next time they'd pick up right where they left off. When Louis's mom arrived later to collect him, he was still wearing the watermelon socks and green cape. She gave him a bemused look, but didn't ask questions, and he decided not to explain. Some things, he thought, were better kept as part of the secret, slightly chaotic and entirely harmless world of game night at the Garners. The next morning came with that soft, golden light that seeps in through half-closed curtains and feels like it has nowhere else to be but your room. Louis stirred awake slowly, at first not entirely sure where he was until his eyes caught the green cape tangled in the blanket at his feet. The events of the night before came back to him in a blur of laughter, forfeits, wading pools, and a strangely heroic number of hats. He could hear muffled voices from somewhere downstairs. Missy and Prissy were clearly already awake, and judging by the rise and fall of their tone, probably arguing over something trivial in that way only siblings could. It was a comfortable kind of noise, though, one that made the house feel alive. For a moment, he considered just rolling over and dozing back off, but curiosity tugged at him. After all, game night might technically have ended, but that didn't mean the Garners had stopped inventing ways to keep things interesting. Padding down the hall in his watermelon socks, Louis followed the smell of something sweet wafting from the kitchen. He found Missy standing on a chair at the counter, flipping through a cookbook with one hand while the other absent-mindedly held a mixing spoon. Prissy, meanwhile, was hunched over the toaster like she was guarding it from thieves. "We're making cinnamon toast," Missy declared without looking up. "But not just any cinnamon toast. This is a challenge round." Louis raised an eyebrow, immediately wary. "A breakfast challenge?" "Yep," Prissy said, glancing over her shoulder with a sly smile. "We each get to make our own, but we have to incorporate one secret ingredient chosen by the others." She slid a small bowl toward him. "Yours is marshmallows." Louis blinked at the fluffy white pieces, already imagining the sticky chaos they might create. The challenge quickly spiraled into exactly the kind of delightful mess Louis had come to expect here. Missy's toast ended up with a layer of strawberry jam under the cinnamon sugar. Prissy's featured peanut butter and a pinch of chili powder, and Louise, armed with mini marshmallows, decided to toast them on top until they went golden and gooey. The 3 of them taste-tested each creation, giving overly dramatic commentary as though they were hosting a cooking show. "An innovative balance of sweet and heat," Missy announced, nodding solemnly at Prissy's spicy sweet experiment. "A bold marshmallow strategy," Prissy countered, gesturing toward Louis's gooey, sticky masterpiece. Messy, but surprisingly good. It was ridiculous, but by the time they finished, the plate was empty and the kitchen smelled like a bakery. After breakfast, the day unfolded in that lazy, open-ended way weekends sometimes do. The morning sun lit up the backyard, still dotted with the 2 wading pools from the night before, and Missy suggested they rehydrate the battlefield for one last round. This time, though, they swapped out the ball for sponges, big waterlogged ones that slapped satisfyingly when they hit their target. The new rule was simple. If you got hit, you had to freeze in place until someone tagged you free, which quickly turned the game into a chaotic mix of dodging, splashing, and laughing so hard it was difficult to throw straight. By the end, all 3 of them were soaked to the skin, hair plastered to their faces, and grinning like they'd just conquered the world. When they finally called a truce, Prissy spread out towels on the grass and flopped down dramatically. "I declare this the official close of game weekend," she said in the kind of voice people use when announcing something monumental. "All future game nights must now meet the high standards we set here." Missy propped herself up on her elbows. "Which means," she added, "we have to make a record of every challenge, rule, and ridiculous outfit for the archives." Lewis groaned, half joking. "You're making a rule book?" "Not a rule book," Prissy corrected, "a legend." She gestured like she was unveiling a grand mural. "One day people will speak of the great marshmallow toast round and the triple hat makeover of 2025. Lewis shook his head, but there was no denying the warmth in his chest at the thought. By the time Lewis's mom arrived later to pick him up, the sun was dipping low again, streaking the sky with pink and gold. He stood on the Garner's porch in dry clothes, his hair still faintly smelling of cinnamon sugar from breakfast. Missy handed him a small folded piece of paper. "For next time," she said. He opened it to find a single sentence written in large looping letters. "Your first forfeit is already waiting." He looked up to see both sisters grinning at him, like cats with a secret. He shook his head, stuffing the note in his pocket, but he knew, whether he admitted it out loud or not, that he'd be back for the next round. Maybe not because he had to, maybe because, in a way, he already wanted to.